The Bioceuticals Clinical Mastery Series is designed to give clinicians the confidence and insight to support your patients and manage common clinical presentations. Each month, leading industry clinicians present cutting-edge research, clinically validated testing protocols, and patient management insights. Find out what the next Bioceuticals Clinical Mastery topic is at bioceuticals.com.au. Hi, and welcome to FX Medicine, where we bring you the latest in evidence-based, integrative, functional, and complementary medicine. FX Medicine acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, where we live and work, and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. With us today is Professor Imran Meir, a world-renowned gastroenterologist and neuroscientist with over 35 years of experience in the study of clinical and neurobiological aspects of how the digestive system and the nervous system interact in health and disease. He has published over 350 peer-reviewed scientific articles and has published 2 great books that I highly recommend, The Mind-Gut Connection and The Gut-Immune Connection. So welcome to FX Medicine, Imran. Thanks for being with us today.
Well, thanks for inviting me to be on the show. It's a pleasure.
It's definitely a pleasure to have you here. So over the last decade or so, we have begun to finally appreciate the critical role that the gut has on health and disease, and in particular the bidirectional relationship between the gut and the brain. And I know there's an increasing body of research that confirms that the gut and the diversity of a microbiome could influence how we think and feel, and is linked to mental health conditions and even neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline. So I know that there are, several lifestyle and dietary, environmental and biological factors that can influence the health of our gut and the diversity of our gut microbiome. Can you just briefly summarise what these factors may be that might be influencing our gut microbiome?
Yeah, so I'd like to start out to saying that the brain-gut microbiome axis, in my opinion, is the central homeostatic regulator in our bodies. Almost everything is transmitted through this system. So the food that we ingest is obviously a major factor, but there's also other molecules that the body produces, like bile acid or estrogen, for example, or androgen, which is secreted with the bile into the gut, which influences the microbes, and the microbes break it down. So food and chemicals that we ingest, toxins, are the main influences from the gut side. So the brain-gut microbiome, people have referred to it as the brain-gut microbiome axis. I like to call it system because it communicates in both ways. But at the lower end, at the gut end of this brain-gut microbiome axis, food is the main influence that changes. But then you look at the brain, and the brain sends signals, every emotional state in the brain or acute and chronic stress sends signals down to the gut, including the habitat, which modulates the gut, which is the home for the microbes and changes their behavior. But it also, these stress mediators like norepinephrine, they can also directly affect receptors on the microbes and change their behavior. So now you have 2 major influences. You have food on the one side, you have the brain and emotional states and stress on the other end of the axis. And then there's other factors like physical exercise, for example. It's been shown that moderate exercise has a beneficial effect on the diversity and the health of the microbiome. Severe exercise, like ultramarathons, actually have the opposite effect, are not good for the gut or the microbiome. And athletes have many of such problems related to these negative effects. Then there's also sleep. Sleep is another major thing, obviously goes through the brain. But sleep has a major anti-inflammatory effect. So healthy, regenerative sleep plays a major role in inactivating inflammatory mediators that might come from the gut. So it has a regulatory effect on the system as well. So I would say lifestyle factors such as food and exercise and sleep are probably the main determinant of the health of the microbiome.
Okay, so you've got your diet that's going to influence our microbiome and obviously the type of diet that we eat, and then You've mentioned sleep being a positive thing, and then exercise being a positive thing up until a certain point, and then potentially having an adverse effect on our guts if we do too much exercise, like marathon running.
Yeah, and I mean, you may want to add to these three factors medications. So,
Yes.
Medications, in particular the ones that directly affect the microbes, like antibiotics, obviously have a negative effect on the microbial ecosystem.
What does the research say about our mother's prenatal health and stress levels? What impact does that have on a growing newborn?
That's an interesting thing. So a lot of research has shown the early life factors when infant is born, going through the birth canal of the mother, and basically for the first time, the sterile gut of the newborn is colonized by these microbes, which are usually a mixture between the vaginal and the fecal microbiome of the mother. But then the interest moved, further upstream, and it was found that, the vaginal microbiome of the mother is influenced by, for example, stress that the mother experiences, and also by, if the mother had, even in animal models, one dose of an antibiotic, that would affect the vaginal microbiome, and then downstream would affect the infant's colonization of its microbiome. So then also diet of the mother has a big influence. So, for example, if the mother is on the unhealthy Western, or, it's called the standard American diet, it creates this low-grade inflammatory state called metabolic endotoxemia. So women that are obese and have type 2 diabetes or have this metabolic endotoxemia, when they deliver a child, this child already is exposed in utero, the brain of this child, to this low-grade inflammation. But then also when it comes to the birth canal, it gets a compromised dose of microbes from the mother. So there's really two ways that this negatively affects the infant microbiome. It's probably the most important programming phase in the human's life, these first, both the prenatal, then the perinatal, and the postnatal 3 years. Probably the most important phase for long-lasting, sometimes permanent changes or damage can happen.
As a psychologist, we often talk about the health of the mother in utero, the impact it has on the growing baby, and we would often think about it in terms of its impact on stress hormones and all those factors, which is certainly happening. But it sounds like potentially it's impacting on the child's gut microbiome when they get born, and so that could potentially have an impact on their health, including their mental health.
Yeah, and you have these dual factors. One is mediated by the microbiome, as we just talked about, and the other one, these stress models. So we've worked a lot with these maternal separation models where either a pregnant mother is being stressed, and you look at the effect on the nervous system, on the stress system of the offspring, or you do that stress on the mother of newborn animals, and that will have a major effect. So there's multiple avenues, one of them being mediated by the microbes, an important one. So it has a long-lasting effect, not just on diseases like allergies that are sort of starting early in life, but also programming the microbiome in a way that it's more susceptible, for example, for cognitive decline later in life, or Parkinson's and depression and anxiety. So I think if you had to focus on one thing to improve population gut microbial health, you would probably want to invest your efforts and your money early on in life, from pregnancy to the first 3 years of life.
So there's obviously then critical periods in life where exposure to certain factors such as, stresses can have a profound impact and permanent effect on the gut microbiome. Is that correct? Is there a point where once you're exposed to it, there's going to be long-standing effects on the microbiome?
I'm always impressed about the resilience of biology and biological systems. So it's not that if you had negative exposures as a child, or if your mother was stressed during pregnancy, that your fate is sealed for the rest of your life. There's always things that you can do in terms of counteract these negative influences.
Yep.
So, for example, then healthy lifestyle, healthy diet, not taking an antibiotic for every respiratory infection. Mm-hmm. The big question is, does it return the microbiome then to a optimal state, or just it improves within a certain bandwidth, but the upper limit of that bandwidth is still compromised compared to somebody who grows up in a perfect world,
Yeah. I was interested, I was reading your book on the gut immune connection book that you recently published, and you talk about how even the soil and its microbiome have changed over time. Can you tell us how soil is different now and reasons why?
Yeah, so the changes in the soil mainly have to do with industrial agriculture, with this mass production of corn and soybean and, miles and miles of these monocultures with tractors going through and plowing, turning the soil upside down without regenerating the soil with cover crops or rotating different crops over the year, where you basically replenish the soil with the kind of nutrients and bacteria that the soil under the natural conditions would have. So the diversity and the abundance of soil microbes has gone down significantly, particularly in these areas where industrial agriculture, both with the tilling and with the use of chemical fertilizer, which basically replaces the microbes. So typically, the microbes would interact with the root system of plants, and in a very elaborate symbiosis would stimulate the plants to produce phytonutrients, help to absorb minerals and many things. So with chemical agriculture, the plants grow big and fast without the help of the microbes. So all these elaborate mechanisms that are built into nature, into these interactions of soil microbes with the plant roots and then enhancing the nutrient content of these plants, all this is being eliminated through chemical agriculture. So we don't see it. The plants look great. They get bigger and bigger, and many of them lose their flavor if it's fruits and vegetables. But also the plants no longer produce these molecules by which they defend themselves against pests and diseases. So that requires another input of chemicals. So essentially we have replaced the normal life cycle of plants and soil microbes with a system where we suppress these natural systems and rely totally on the chemicals. So there's a growing movement of what's called regenerative organic agriculture, or using cover crops and not using extensive tilling, sort of giving back to the soil the things that we take out by growing millions of tons of produce. So we're giving this back, and people have shown that it's actually more cost effective. You need a lot less chemicals to grow your plants, and the plants are better, healthier than if you grow them in the modern, traditional way.
And so does that change in the soil? Does that then also influence our microbiome?
Yeah, so this is the interesting thing. So in the natural environment, the soil is abundant with microbes. Not as dense and not as concentrated as in our gut, but pretty close to it. And these microbes constantly interact with the rhizosome, which are the little rootlets in the roots of a plant. And there's an interaction. The plant secretes sugar-like molecules, which attracts the microbes, and then the microbes stimulate the plant to produce what's called polyphenols, or often the misnomer of antioxidants, which are then transported by the plant into the leaves, the fruits, the vegetables. And when we eat these plant-based products, then we consume these polyphenols that originated from the interaction of soil microbes with the plant rootlets. And these polyphenols are not absorbed in our small intestine because they're such big molecules. So they travel down the intestine where they are met by the microbes, and the microbes in the gut now break them down into small molecules that are both beneficial for the microbes, for our gut microbes, and beneficial for many functions of our bodies and our brain. So you have this complex system. It starts in the soil, goes through the plant's products, goes through our digestive tract, and ends up with microbes in our gut. And the gut transforms it into health-promoting molecules.
Okay, so it's the polyphenols in the plants that then potentially kind of impact on the gut microbiome. So it's not necessarily the polyphenols and the antioxidant effects, it's more around what potentially it could do on the gut microbiome.
Yeah, so in the literature, many of these polyphenols, if you test them in a test tube, they act on cells. They act like antioxidants. But when you eat those polyphenols with your fruits and vegetables, they cannot be absorbed. They don't show up in your bloodstream. It's only the breakdown product created by the microbes in your gut that become absorbable, and less than 5% of the beneficial effects of polyphenols can be ascribed to the antioxidant effects. It's a growing science to find out what all these metabolites, these polyphenol metabolites, do to our various organs. I mean, a very interesting finding is that it improves the inner lining of our blood vessels, so the endothelium. It improves that function and prevents inflammatory changes that are caused when that inner lining is disturbed. So that's been shown in the heart, been shown in the brain, that many of our most common chronic diseases are related to this low-grade inflammation. And so what these polyphenols do, what these metabolites of polyphenols, they improve the endothelial function of these blood vessels, get rid of the inflammation, and prevent the downstream effect that we have chronic ongoing inflammation in our blood vessels in the heart or in the brain or in the liver. So the impact of this on our health overall, of these systems that we've been talking about, is tremendous. We just have not fully scientifically understood it. We know that eating lots of fruits and vegetables is good for your cardiovascular health and your brain health and health in general. But we don't know exactly all the molecular mechanisms that are underlie this. But these vascular anti-inflammatory benefits, I think, are a big part of the story.
Yeah, I know that there's a good body of research demonstrating that polyphenols can have a really positive effect on mental health and cognitive health. Me personally, I've done lots of research on curcumin and saffron in terms of its impact on depression and anxiety. And I wrote a paper several years ago where there was obviously a lot of work interested in trying to increase the bioavailability of curcumin. And so in this paper, I wrote, well, maybe it's not bioavailability, but it's impact on the gut that curcumin has many of its potential effects, and that kind of fits with what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, curcumin is another molecule. It's one of those big molecules that cannot be absorbed by our small intestine. So it just behaves like these other polyphenols that I mentioned to you. It requires the microbial metabolism to be turned into these anti-inflammatory components, which have been shown, with curcumin, turmeric. It's been shown in randomized controlled studies, for example, that it has benefit on inflammatory bowel disease, the significant inflammation of the large intestine. And most likely, regular high consumption of turmeric will probably reduce this chronic inflammatory state that seems to be like the common denominator now of our chronic diseases. You can almost find in the literature like all roads lead to Rome. You can almost say all roads lead to chronic low-grade inflammation, and it does start in the gut because 70% of our immune system is located in the gut.
And it's just amazing that we've neglected it and really haven't considered the importance of it, but certainly we're becoming more and more aware of it. So we've got then the changes in the soil, then that affects the polyphenol kind of abundance or even the diversity that's potentially occurring. I also saw a paper, just briefly read the abstract of the paper actually, but there was also some research showing that gardeners or people who engaged in regular gardening versus people who didn't engage in regular gardening, and their microbiome was also different. So is even potentially exposure actually to the soil? Is that possible?
I mean, there's different possibilities how this could happen. So certainly, if you don't constantly disinfect your hands when you work in the garden, plants and fruit have millions of microbes living on them. It's really mind-boggling how many microbes are on the surface of an apple or in the core of an apple. And so if you expose yourself by handling this and not necessarily constantly washing your hands, you will incorporate many of these microbes into your digestive system, and they will be in your household. It's also been shown that with farm animals, if you grew up on a farm with farm animals, you will have a different gut microbiome with greater diversity, and that's with gardening probably as well. Then there's also the psychological aspect. Clearly, the relaxing effect and the mindfulness effect of gardening through this mechanism that I mentioned earlier, that the brain sends these signals down to the gut all the time, will have an effect on the microbes as well.
Yeah, unless you're a gardener like me, where you kill everything and it just stresses you out. But yeah, potentially. All
Yeah.
right. Now, the other thing I wanted to briefly just talk about was obviously the foods we eat now have changed, as has the quality, which can affect our gut. But in your books, you also talk about how we eat and the timing of the food intake can affect gut microbiome. And obviously there's increasing interest in meal timing and fasting and intermittent eating and time-restricted eating and all those different options. Can the timing and doing fasts and intermittent eating, can that affect our microbiome positively or negatively?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously different fasting techniques.
Yeah.
I think most of them, unless you do it for spiritual reasons and, go to meditation retreats on a regular basis, I don't think they necessarily apply to the average person. But time-restricted eating is something that has a lot of theoretical and practical benefits, both in animal models and in humans. And it is something practical. It's feasible. With a little bit of discipline, you compress your eating time into 8 hours. It's not certain when this has to be, if it's in the morning or if it's towards the evening. But that for 16 hours, you keep your GI tract empty from entering food into it. So let's say you have your last meal. It takes about an hour or an hour and a half before this meal has emptied your stomach and your small intestine. And then you got this basically empty of nutrients coming in. And it will switch to a different pattern of contraction and secretion and blood flow and immune function. So it essentially switches into a different operating mode. It's a rhythmic pattern. Every 90 minutes, there's a wave of forceful contractions going from the esophagus all the way down into the end of your intestine. And it moves things. So any bacteria that have overgrown or have an increased abundance in your first part of your small intestine, every 24 hours will move everything down towards the large intestine, and excessive amounts of bacteria that may have ended up in the small intestine will be moved back to where they belong, which is the colon or the large intestine. So that's one effect of this time-restricted eating, a very important one. Mm-hmm. The other one, so you automatically eat less. Like in the evening, if you have your meal at, let's say, at 7 o'clock, you don't sit in front of the TV and eat snacks or go to the fridge and drink a beer. So you essentially consume less because you want to keep the 16 hours free of any exposure to nutrients. And so that's another factor. A third factor is that it actually has been shown to change what's been called the gut microbial geography. So how close the microbes get to the layer of your gut. So normally they're separated by a mucus layer. When you fasted, they move closer to the actual wall of the gut and interact more with the receptors on the side. So there's multiple things happening from, change in the habitat, decrease in caloric intake, and then direct changes in microbial function. So we noticed the gradual decrease in weight, which was easy to maintain as long as you stick with that kind of diet. It is a little bit difficult to maintain, with social activities or when you travel. But as a regular eating pattern, I think it's something that I would highly recommend.
So you're eating in an 8-hour window. Is there a particular time when that should start? Or you mentioned kind of after 7 p.m. So do you generally go from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m.? Is that your eating window?
Yeah. And for some people, depending on their work schedule, or it varies. It's interesting. So in animal studies, it's clearly been shown to have major metabolic benefits, decreased inflammation, better, metabolic health of these animals. They didn't gain weight even though they had free access to unlimited amounts of calories. In humans, it's been more difficult to show this. So there's studies that have shown the same benefit in humans and others have not.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of factors, obviously, and anytime you try to replicate something in a human population, which is heterogeneous weight-wise and dietary habit-wise, and it's always difficult to prove it. For us personally, as a scientist, I shouldn't say this, but having experienced this myself, I would say it does work if you stick to it in a rigorous fashion.
Yeah, and it is achievable. It's eating that in an 8-hour window. If you kind of get used to it, it's certainly achievable. So whereas some different diets and your fasting diets and things like that can be a lot more difficult to do. So.
Yeah, it's not realistic. Also, this 8-16, this time-restricted eating, it's more like the normal eating rhythm that our bodies have evolved to. I mean, what we're doing today, everybody always needs energy bars and snacks the whole day, and then in the evening on the TV, it's a constant influx of calories into our gut, which was not the case even, 75 years ago.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of returning, like many other things, returning to traditional patterns of lifestyle and including food intake.
Actually, last week I did the fasting mimicking diets, which I'd never done before. So 5 days on that fasting mimicking diet. And I did it. It was, I didn't feel bad. I did, energy-wise, I was okay, but just so repetitive and boring. So not sure whether I will do it again, but I don't know how people can do the fasting ongoing, that's for sure. There's just that pleasure of food that sometimes, and the social connections and the social engagement and things that, just the lifestyle stuff that you can't do with the fasting, that's for sure.
And this is a really big thing. I'm glad that you mentioned it. I mean, the early studies on the Mediterranean and the health benefits of the Mediterranean diet, which have been criticized, but one thing that the authors noted at the time in the 60s was this remarkable social interaction of people in the Mediterranean countries around food. And you could almost say, food is the one element that holds people together, on festivities and celebrations and funerals. Like, it's almost like the glue of social interactions. And if you break that, or if you make food intake a non-enjoyable activity that's always with anxieties and worries in your brain that you're eating the wrong thing, I personally think that's a big part of the negative effects of what's called the standard American diet, that you have almost eliminated that portion of lifestyle around food, the positive reinforcers.
Definitely. Okay, so look, I could keep going forever. There's so much content. I mean, in your books, there's so much information, and I certainly highly recommend it for people who haven't read your books in the past. So we'll certainly have links to it in the show notes. Just finally, are there any tips or recommendations for holistic practitioners who are working in this area that you can give to help them working with their patients?
Just one comment about this. It's interesting. I've always been kind of critical of functional medicine in the U.S., but then I've gotten invited to quite a few of their meetings. And, I have to say that from a general perspective, this holistic view of the body and the importance of lifestyles, paying attention to lifestyles, is something I really like about any of these holistic, healthcare approaches. And I think when it gets to the specifics, I'm more critical. I like to pay attention to evidence, because if we stop paying attention to evidence, then we just have to say, we're all selling placebos or prescribing placebos, which is not a bad thing either, because I think we have underestimated the power of the placebo response. But I would recommend in general, if you can afford and have access to a healthy, varied diet, and you do the things that we talked about, you pay attention to what you eat, predominantly plant-based, where the food comes from, how is it grown, is it grown in a regenerative organic way, or at least an organic way without all the chemicals on it? When do you eat? Can you change your lifestyle to restrict it to a certain time of the day? Eliminate or greatly reduce sugar consumption, and have your moderate daily exercise. There's also some recent study on one of the polyphenols, on the flavonols, a study done in thousands of people, a 3-year intervention with placebo or with the supplement in a capsule form. And it showed the benefit on mortality and morbidity from cardiovascular diseases. And there will be another study coming out from the same population that there's also decrease in the prevalence of cognitive decline. Those studies are rare, because they're obviously very expensive, costing millions of dollars. But it was also interesting, these flavanol supplements worked best in the people that did not have a high natural flavanol intake. So they were the ones that were actually probably not on a healthy plant-based diet, largely plant-based diet.
Yeah, absolutely. So you really need to concentrate on our diet and our sleep and our exercise and our social connections and our stress levels. They're absolutely the integral part of one's overall health. Out of curiosity, what was the supplement that you're referring to in that study?
That supplement, it's flavanol. It's one of the flavonoids, and you have to take the same doses that was used in the study. It's not inexpensive, but I think if you are concerned about your cardiovascular and your brain health, it's pretty worth the investment to use that.
Well, terrific. Well, thank you very much, Imran, for joining us today. And thank you very much for the research that you've done in the area. And you've just published an immense amount of articles and scientific papers in the area. And the two books, The Mind-Gut Connection and The Gut-Immune Connection, they're great. And I certainly recommend anybody interested in the gut and the brain and the microbiome to read those books. They're terrific. So thank you very much for the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me on the show. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I hope your audience will get some benefit out of this as well.
So thanks everyone for listening today. Don't forget that you can find all the show notes, transcripts and other resources from today's episode on the FX Medicine website. I'm Dr. Adrian Lopresti, and thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
This podcast is intended as healthcare practitioner education only, and it is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
Make sure you never miss an FX Medicine episode by subscribing to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.